Wyoming Territory, 1888. Silas Thorne had come to chop firewood. He did not know he was about to hear the sentence that would change the rest of his life. The air carried the sharp, clean scent of lodgepole pine and distant, unforgiving snow. High above the valley, the Teton Range stood like jagged teeth against a bruised blue sky. Silas Thorne pulled his wagon to a halt near the edge of the Bennett property. He was 32 years old. His shoulders were broadened by a decade of hard, thankless labor. He climbed down from the seat. His boots crunched on the dry mountain grass. The sun was bright, but it offered no warmth. It was the kind of day that whispered of a long, cruel winter ahead. Silas looked toward the small log cabin nestled against the foothills. Smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney.
It was a quiet house. It was too quiet for a place that used to ring with the laughter of 3 strong men. Clara Bennett stood on the porch. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. She wore a deep blue dress that matched the shadows of the mountains. Her hair was the color of autumn wheat. It was gathered in a practical bun that was starting to loosen at the temples. She didn't wave. She didn't turn away. She simply watched him with steady, searching eyes. Silas reached for the double-bit axe in the back of his wagon. He didn't ask for permission. In the Wyoming Territory, survival was a shared debt. Silas knew Clara's woodpile was dangerously low. He walked to the chopping block near the side of the house.
The logs were thick mountain mahogany and seasoned fir. They were stubborn things. They required a strong arm and a clear mind. Silas took off his vest and tossed it onto a fence rail. He spat on his palms. He gripped the hickory handle. The first swing was clean. The wood groaned and split wide open. It revealed a pale, fragrant heart. Silas worked with a rhythmic intensity. The thwack of the axe echoed against the canyon walls. It was a lonely sound. It was the sound of a man trying to fix a broken world. Clara stepped down from the porch. She moved with a grace that the years of hardship hadn't managed to steal. She was 41 years old. In this territory, 41 could carry more grief than many lifetimes. She had buried a husband and a teenage son during the Great Winter of 1886. The cattlemen called it the Big Die-Up. The history books would remember it as the end of the open range. Thousands of head of livestock had perished in the drifts. Clara's husband, Thomas, had gone out to save the herd. He never came back. They found him 3 days later. He was frozen beneath a willow tree. Their son Henry followed him into the white silence just a week later. Fever took what the cold had missed. Since then, Clara had managed the Bennett Ranch alone. She had a grit that made the locals whisper in the general store. She refused to sell. She refused to move to the safety of Cheyenne. She stayed because the land held the only pieces of her family she had left. Silas continued to chop. His breath hitched in the freezing air. He had been a friend to Henry. They had hunted elk in these very mountains. Coming here was a debt he felt he could never fully repay. But this was not the first time he had come. All through the last winter, he had brought flour, repaired broken rails, and cleared snow from her door without being asked. Clara never called it courting. Silas never dared to call it love. But both of them knew the truth was growing quietly between them. There was more to it than debt now. There was a feeling in his chest he couldn't name. Clara stopped a few feet away. Her hands were tucked into her apron pockets. "You're going to tire yourself out before noon, Silas," she said. Her voice was like worn velvet. It was soft but durable. Silas didn't stop his swing. "I've got plenty of energy, Mrs. Bennett," he replied. "The frost is coming early this year." "I noticed," she said, looking toward the jagged peaks. "The elk are moving down into the flats already." Silas paused. He leaned his weight on the axe handle. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He looked at Clara. She was smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was a weary sort of smile. "You're a good man for doing this," she whispered. "I'm just a neighbor," Silas said. He picked up another log. Neighbors don't usually spend 3 days a week fixing fences for nothing, Clara remarked. Silas felt a heat in his neck. It had nothing to do with the sun. Your husband helped my father build our first barn, Silas said. I'm just returning the favor, even if I'm 20 years late. Clara let out a short, sudden laugh. It was a beautiful sound. It was as rare as a desert flower in a drought. 20 years, she repeated. She shook her head. She stepped closer to the pile of split wood. Where were you 20 years ago, Silas Thorne? She joked. The question was light, but the air between them suddenly felt heavy. Silas looked her straight in the eye. I was 12 years old, ma'am, he said quietly. I was busy learning how to tie my own boots. Clara's smile softened. It turned into something complex. It looked like regret. It looked like longing. Yes, she breathed. I suppose you were. She reached out as if to touch his arm. She pulled back at the last second. I was 24 then, she said to the mountains. I had just married Thomas. I was the happiest woman in the territory. Silas didn't know what to say. He turned back to the wood. He swung with more force than necessary. The wood shattered under his blade. He wanted to tell her that the years didn't matter. He wanted to tell her he didn't see a widow. He didn't see an older woman. He saw Clara. He saw the woman who had taught him how to read when the schoolhouse burned. He saw the woman who always had a kind word for a lonely boy. But the words felt too large for his mouth. They felt like a betrayal of the dead. Clara watched him for a long minute. Then she turned and walked back toward the cabin. There's coffee on the stove when you're ready, she called. Silas watched her go. He watched the way her blue dress swayed in the wind. He felt a tug in his chest. It was both painful and sweet. He knew the town of Bittersweet Creek talked about them. He knew they wondered why a young man in his prime was always here. They didn't understand the silence of the frontier. They didn't understand how a person could become an anchor in a storm. He chopped for another hour. His muscles screamed. The woodpile was now a fortress against the winter. He gathered his vest. He walked to the porch. He removed his hat. He knocked on the doorframe. Come in, Silas, Clara said. The cabin was warm. It smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. It was a woman's touch in a hard, masculine land. Silas sat at the heavy oak table. Clara placed a tin cup of coffee in front of him. Her hand brushed his. Neither of them pulled away immediately. The silence stretched out. It was filled with the ticking of the mantel clock. Silas, she said, sitting across from him, you can't keep doing this. Doing what? He asked. Living your life for a ghost, she said. You're young. You should be looking for a girl in town, a girl who can give you a family. Silas set the cup down with a dull thud. I'm not interested in the girls in town, he said firmly. They're fine for dancing, but they don't know anything about real life. They haven't seen what we've seen. Clara looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were red and chapped. I'm old enough for people to call this foolish, Silas, she whispered. It was the first time she had given fear a name. The words hung in the air like a threat. Silas leaned forward. My mother died when I was 10, he said. You are nothing like her. Age is just a number people use when they are afraid of feeling something real, Clara. What matters is who is standing next to you when the blizzard hits. Clara looked up. Her eyes were wet with unshed tears. It's not proper, she said. Her voice lacked conviction. People will say I've bewitched you. They'll say you're taking advantage of a lonely woman. Silas reached across the table. He took her hand. This time he didn't let go. Let them talk, he said. Let them whisper until their throats are dry. I'm not going anywhere. The week following their conversation was a blur of activity. The sky grew gray and heavy. It hung low over the valley. The history of the West is written in ice. Another brutal winter storm was looming over the northern plains. People still spoke in frightened voices about the great blizzards of 1888. Wyoming might not have taken the worst of them, but every rancher knew what that kind of sky could mean. Silas spent every spare moment at the Bennett Ranch. He brought over a slaughtered hog. He helped Clara salt the meat. They worked in the smokehouse. Their breaths mingled in the cold air. There was a new ease between them. It was a shared understanding. One afternoon, they were hanging the last of the hams. Clara stopped. She looked at Silas. He was covered in salt and grease. "Why did you really come back after the funeral, Silas?" she asked. Silas hung the hook on the rafter. "I came back because I couldn't stop thinking about you," he admitted. "I remembered how you looked at the grave. You didn't cry. You just looked like someone had emptied out your soul. I couldn't live with that." Clara leaned against the wooden slats. "I was empty," she said. "I thought the world ended when Thomas and Henry died. I did not know how to keep living with that much silence. But then I saw you at the fence line, just standing there, waiting. You gave me a reason to keep the fire going." Silas stepped closer. His heart thumped against his ribs. "I want to be more than a reason to keep the fire going, Clara," he said. He reached out. He traced the line of her jaw. "I want to be the one who brings the wood. I want to be the one who sits in the chair next to yours." Clara closed her eyes. She leaned into his touch. "Silas," she whispered. "The world is so cruel. It will try to tear us apart." "Let it try," Silas vowed. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. It was a promise. A few days later, Silas went into Bittersweet Creek for supplies. The town was small and judgmental. It was a collection of wooden shacks and hearts. As he loaded sacks of flour, he felt the eyes on him. The men leaning against the livery stable were smirking. Jedediah Miller stepped forward. He was a man twice Silas's age with a mean streak. "Heading back to the widow's nest, Thorn," Jedediah sneered. Silas ignored him. He tightened the ropes on his load.
"Must be nice," Jedediah continued, "having a lonely widow cook your meals and warm your house. Does she still smell like her husband's old shirts?" The world went very still. Silas dropped the rope. He turned around. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Say that again, Jed," Silas said. His voice was dangerously low. The crowd of onlookers grew quiet. Jedediah laughed, but it sounded forced. "I'm just saying, it's a bit pathetic. A young buck like you chasing after a woman who's already seen her best days. You should find yourself a girl who can actually bear you a son." Silas didn't wait for another word. He crossed the distance in 2 strides. He grabbed Jedediah by the collar. He held him hard against the side of the wagon. "Clara Bennett is a lady," Silas hissed. "She has more dignity in her little finger than you have in your whole miserable body. If I ever hear you speak her name again, I'll do more than just talk." Jedediah's eyes went wide with fear. He saw the raw power in Silas's arms. He saw a man who had nothing to lose. All right, Jedediah stammered. Silas shoved him away. He climbed onto his wagon. He drove out of town without looking back. His hands were shaking on the reins. He realized he would stand against any man for her. He would risk everything for her. When he arrived at the ranch, Clara was waiting. She saw the look on his face. "What happened in town?" she asked. Her voice was trembling. Silas climbed down and walked to her. He took her hands. "Nothing that matters," he said. "But I realized something today. I realized that I don't want to wait for the winter to pass." He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, simple gold band. He had bought it weeks ago in secret. Then slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee in the frozen yard. His voice shook, but his eyes did not. "Clara Bennett, I am a man of few words," he said.
I don't have much to offer but these hands and this land. But I love you with everything I am. Will you marry me?" Clara gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. The tears she had held back for years finally spilled over. "Silas, the town, the people," she sobbed. "Let the people talk," Silas said softly. "I am not asking them, Clara. I am asking you." Clara looked at the ring. She saw the strength in him.
She saw the boy she had once known and the man he had become. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Silas Thorne." They were married in the small parlor 2 weeks later. A traveling preacher performed the ceremony. There were no guests. There was no music, just the sound of the wind howling outside. Clara wore her blue dress. Her hands trembled when Silas slipped the ring onto her finger. Not from doubt, from the shock of being chosen again. Silas wore his best black coat. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Silas kissed her. It wasn't a debt anymore.
It was a new beginning. The winter of 1888 was indeed one of the harshest on record. The snow drifted as high as the cabin roof. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero, but the Bennett Thorne Ranch stayed warm. Silas spent his days in the barn. He tended to the few cattle they had left. Clara spent her days by the fire. She mended clothes. She prepared meals. They were isolated, but they weren't lonely. In the evenings, they sat together at the oak table. One night, the blizzard rattled the windows. Clara looked at Silas. She reached out and traced the wedding band on his finger. "You know," she said with a twinkle in her eye, "I still wonder." "Wonder what?" Silas asked. "Where you were 20 years ago," she teased. Silas laughed. He pulled her closer. "I was waiting for you, Clara," he said. "I just didn't know it yet. And I'll be right here for the next 22. The years that followed weren't easy. Wyoming was a place that tested every soul. They faced droughts and predators. They faced the judgment of the town. But they thrived. They built a life on a foundation of respect. Clara never felt like an old woman in Silas's arms. Silas never felt like a foolish boy in her eyes. They proved that the heart doesn't care about the calendar. They proved that some things are timeless. As Silas grew older, his hair grayed at the temples, but his arms stayed strong. He still chopped the firewood every Tuesday. He still brought Clara wildflowers. And every time she thanked him, she would whisper, "You're late, Silas Thorne." And he would always reply, "I got here as fast as I could." Their story became a legend in Bittersweet Creek. It was a reminder that the frontier wasn't just built on gold. It was built on quiet courage. It was built on the dignity of loving against the odds. Clara lived to be 82 years old. She died peacefully in the same bed where she had found her second chance. Silas stayed by her side until the end. He held her hand as the sun set over the Tetons. He didn't cry. He simply looked at her and whispered, "Wait for me by the fence line, Clara. I'll be there soon." He buried her next to Thomas and Henry, but he stayed on the ranch. He kept the fires burning. He kept the woodpile high, because he knew that love never truly leaves a place. It stays in the rafters.
It stays in the soil. It stays in the memory of a man who chopped wood for his neighbor and found his soul in the process. In the end, their love became the quiet kind of legend people remembered when winter came. Not because it was perfect, but because it was brave. A young man had stood beside a lonely widow when the world told him to walk away, and Clara Bennett had dared to believe her heart was not finished yet. That was the true justice of the West. Not revenge, not pride, but the courage to love when others said you had no right to.